Hey everybody, welcome to Planet Coaster College. In this video I'll be talking about the Aero Hyper Coaster and showing you how to build one. And in a sense, it's a bit of a sequel to the Aero Looping Coaster tutorial, since much like the Aero Looping Coaster, this is really a classic kind of ride. It's a bit outdated, it's a bit old compared to some of the newer hyper coasters out there, but that's kind of the charm of it as well. And what I want to start off this video with is actually the definition of a hyper coaster, because this is quite a contested area, because there are many ways to define one. I would say there are generally 3 ways to define them, though the basic 2 ways are basically by height and the type of coaster. So to take the first one, the height of the coaster, a coaster is regarded as a hypercoaster usually when it exceeds 200 feet in height, which is 60.96 meters, so everybody just kind of disregards that and uses feet here anyway, which is based off the first hypercoaster that was ever built, Magnum XL 200, not to be confused with the Magnum XL, which is a hypercoaster by Aero. It was the first hypercoaster to ever be built and the tallest coaster when it was built, and it's also a very good example for this kind of coaster. Now the problem with calling a coaster a hypercoaster just because it's taller than 200 feet is that after that time, especially recently, a lot of coasters have been built that exceed 200 feet but aren't generally seen as hypercoasters, but sort of chucked into that area anyway because they're over 200 feet high. So another way to define hypercoasters then is by the type of layout. Hypercoasters have a very specific kind of layout which looks almost like a wooden coaster. They don't have any inversions. They usually aren't very compact, but instead they have very tall lift hills that are followed by very large hills that give you a sort of wooden coaster skyline, and at some point manage to come back with some sweeping curves, have some more hills and make their way back to the station. So they're not very compact, they don't have any inversions, and it's just focused on the hills, the airtime, and making your way through the curves at an as fast as possible speed, since they were usually the record breakers when it comes to the height. Now of course another way to refer to hypercoasters, especially in game, is by their train design, because they do have a different train design usually than other types of roller coasters, since they don't have to worry about making any inversions, and instead you want to make use of that airtime and these large hills that they have. So they have different trains, and that's something to keep in mind in game, to always take the actual hypercoaster trains if you want to make a hypercoaster. Generally I would say in game, if you want to try to make a realistic hypercoaster, you want to go for all 3 of these points. So you want to actually use the right type of coaster, you want to get over the 200 feet in height, and you want to make sure that it has that typical hypercoaster layout. So how do we do so? Well, that's something that I'm going to show right now. So we're going to take the equalizer right here and place the station as per usual a little bit raised off the ground. And again, since this is an Aero coaster, kind of like the Aero Looping Coaster, I'm not going to worry too much about making this thing smooth, and instead it'll be a bunch of different pre-made elements, all just pasted together almost in a roller coaster tycoon kind of sense. So first, just to get a bit of speed, I want to get a small hill that goes down like this. Could even be a little bit more than that, honestly. Could be quite steep. Just make that a little bit more smooth, but I'm not going to worry too much about how smooth it actually is. Something like that should just about do. And in this case, I just want to add a curve onto the lift hill. It doesn't always have to be a 90-degree curve or anything. Just a small pre-lift hill section before it hooks onto the chain. And at this point we can pretty much get to the chain itself, and as per usual also I want to make this about 30 degrees. The transition into the chain doesn't have to be too smooth, it can be pretty jagged and sudden, so I'm just going for something like this. And the most important point to keep in mind here is that we're building this over 60.96 meters in height, or for anybody who is using the Imperial system, anything that's over 200 feet. And in this case, since it's quite an oldie, I just want to break the record of 200 feet, maybe build it a little bit taller than the coaster before it, but then aside I don't want to make it too tall, so I'm going for something around this height, just a little bit over 200 feet. Now something that I always find very interesting about these when it comes to the drop is that they actually have a very awkward looking drop. It doesn't go down in a very straight kind of section, it actually goes down very gently in a sense. And I suspect, though I don't want to claim anything without actually researching this, I couldn't find anything about this, but I'm pretty sure that this is due to the cable stress, and releasing the car at a lower speed being better for the cable and not putting too much stress on the cable. But in any case, we want to go for a small pre-drop section. Actually, want to hold on to the cable for a little bit over here. We want to have a small pre-drop section which is still quite gentle, something like that. And only after we have that sort of gentle part, we want to go down into the very steep and the good section of the drop. So I want to go down to something like this. And we have a lot of straight track over here, which is not going to end up very smooth, but I actually don't want to smooth that out, because just like a regular old Aero hypercoaster would, this is pretty much just some transitions of the lower parts and the top parts of the hills, with some very straight sections in between for what the hills actually go up and go down with. So I'm going to curve it right here to go up again and go into the second hill. But once we're actually going into the second hill, I just want to keep it 100% straight. Now this is really the classic hyper hill, which is quite steep and has a very gentle bottom of the hill and a very gentle top of the hill. Just fast enough to catch some airtime on it, because that's really on the top of the hills where we're going to want to catch a lot of that. I do want to make it just a bit smoother than that. And something like that should more or less be the shaping for the coaster. It's already starting to get that sort of wooden coaster look to it in terms of the skyline. Now at this point you can add another hill or more or whatever you're looking for, but there's got to be that point on a hyper where you want to turn around. Now there are various ways in which they usually do this if they have this kind of classic sort of out and back layout to them. For instance, Magnum XL has a sort of butterfly looking element to it, and Pepsi Max just does a curve to turn around. But in this case I'm gonna want to try a bit more and show a bit more about the weird and unsmooth banking that these things usually have. So I'm going to go up again for a bit to go into the hill, which is going to be the first hill before we go into the element where it's going to curve around. I want to make sure that each hill is going to be just a bit lower than the hill just before it, so I can actually make this quite a bit lower and stretch it out a bit. Something like this. And what I want to keep in mind is that I want to bank the track before we actually go down. So I'm going to have a part where it's going to go down a little bit here. Or, sorry, I want to bank the track before I go into the curve. So I'm going to have a part where it's going to bank right here. And after that, it seems like a pretty safe place to add the curve. So let's try it. Something like that should work. I do want to stretch this out quite a bit. Actually, that's quite steep still for a curve of one of these coasters. Gonna make that a little bit less steep. And just go around like this. And this part is interesting because we're gonna get back into the station at this point. And this is where I kind of want to show off the very standard roller coaster tycoon kind of way to make hills with these coasters. What you very often see with these coasters is really just hills that are built like this, going straight up, and then we're gonna have these very gentle parts where we go up and down and transition back into an up section. Maybe a little bit more smooth than that, but you get the point. Basically, these do not flow very smoothly whatsoever, and especially on the hills in the later sections of their tracks, where they've already lost a lot of speed and they're just making their way through some of the final airtime hills, which are much smaller. They really are very unsmooth, and shapes like this are definitely not a rare sight on these coasters. I do feel it's starting to fly over my hills at a too large speed, so I actually want to add some trim brakes over here to slow down the rest of the coaster a bit and keep the hills in the later section a bit lower. I'm not sure, but it kind of seems like the friction settings on this coaster is actually quite low in real life. Some of them do lose their speed quite a bit, and I think Magnum XL 200 now has quite a few trims on it as well. But anyway, in my case, it kind of seems like the layout is going to flow better with a couple of trim brakes, so I'll just be adding a few over here. Now we're getting to the end of the track here, where usually it just finishes up the track with a bunch of very small airtime hills, a bit like what I've been doing over here, even though in this case I would say it's a bit more exaggerated than what you see with most of these in real life. There are only 5 though, so I wouldn't really hold on to that idea too much, but some of them do have a bit more turning around action, so by the time that the track is next to the lift hill again, as I have over here, the hills are much smaller. But I still have quite a bit of energy to burn through, since the part with the curve over here is actually quite small and it already goes into the smaller hills over here. So I think I'll be ending off this track with a few more curves into the direction of the station and just ending it up like that. And again, with these curves, they are very unsmooth, just like the hills over here. So first it's starting to bank, then it has the curve, and then it's going to bank straight back into a straight piece. And I'm going to want to do just about the same over here with these curves. I do want to draw them out a little bit as well, because otherwise it's just going to be painfully unsmooth. But this piece is just completely inclined, and then this piece is going to go gentle again, and the next piece is going to go down again. Which sounds all weird, but it's just, you're kind of like doing one thing at a time as you're taking the pieces. So either you're banking or you're really changing the direction of the curve, but you don't see both happening at the same time all the time. Now, since we're almost there again, I want to start at the end of the station to have a slightly inclining brake run, and usually since these are, you know, enormous coasters, they'll want to store another train as well, so they do have a transfer track along with a bunch of brakes to not just bring down the coaster to a lower speed into the station, but also have some block brakes to train another, or to store another train on. I'm going to want to have a pretty lengthy good block section over here. So I'm going to have the, I'm going to have the block brakes over here first at the end. And there's also going to be some brakes to slow down the coaster, and possibly have a brake section on the side here to stall the coasters on the transfer track if they need to. So that's pretty much what I want to have at the end. And at this point I can just connect it back to where I want the coaster to go eventually. So here's the final layout of the coaster, and I'm very serious when I say this isn't really one of my best, not too proud of how it turned out, but it's definitely got all of the basic elements that you're going to want to have in an aero hyper coaster out there. So we have the large lift hill right here, which is by far the largest structure on the coaster. Some of these very sweeping large hills at the beginning section of the coaster, some very long curves in the middle section, which you do see quite often, and some of these typical much smaller, not so smooth hills at the ending section of the coaster, to still make the most out of the very limited speed that it has at the end of the layout. And altogether it's got that very out and back, almost sort of wooden coaster layout to it. There are definitely a bunch of variations on this. I actually switched up this coaster because I didn't want to make it too much like the existing aero coasters, but ways in which you could have some variations on this theme is by either making this section with the hills a bit longer, or maybe having a section with much more curves that twist in and out of each other. I think Titan in Japan is a very good example of that. Or having much more of these very small hills at the end. For instance, I feel like Magnum XL just keeps on going on with these very small hills at the end of the layout where it makes its way back to the station. Anyway, this is just the basic template, and there are many ways to have some variety on this. But just for the ending of this episode, I want to have a quick POV. Alright, so here we go. It's still going very slowly because the cables on these things aren't the most quick things. And the first drop is actually quite steep. It's also very loud for me, whoops. And the second hill is just about fast enough to catch a little bit of airtime on top of that. I am quite happy with the general speed of this coaster. It does go a little bit slow at some points, especially the trim brakes could be trimming a little bit less given the speed at which it's going through this curve, but it's not something that I would say is something to really worry about at this point. It still has a very manageable speed throughout the rest of the layouts, and we're coming back to some of these smaller hills at the end, where there's a bit of awkward curving in here. But generally, you want these things to just be completely straight. It's very simple and boring track when it comes to that. A bit of a curve to make its way back to the station, and I only made this final sort of out and back section because I still had a lot of speed. But if you don't, you can really just make your way back to the station with a quick curve, as long as you do have enough space at the end behind the station to actually have the brake run, which we're finally heading into at this point, and that is pretty much the coaster. There are a couple of things that you might want to change about this. When it comes to the color scheme, the red color, I suppose, is actually taken out of Pepsi Max Big One. I know that some of the developers are actually pretty fond of that coaster, so that's probably where the color scheme came from. But many of these coasters also just have well, not many, but Magnum XL, which is the classical one, has a red and white color scheme, which also works quite well if you actually select the white color. Whoops. There we go. Something like that could work quite well as well. Or I actually like Titan's color scheme quite a bit too, which is yellow with black, which turns out quite interesting. It's actually a bit more gold in this case. I might want to make that a little bit lighter. There's just many ways to have some variety in these color schemes, but what I would want to say is that usually the real life ones don't have too interesting or too bright color schemes, not like many modern B&Ms would have. They are quite boring and predictable color schemes in a sense. Anyway, that just about rounds it up for this video about Aero Hyper coasters. It's not really the best one ever, but it's really just a general idea of how you can make one of these, and I wanted to close this video with another look at how it could look in a real life setting. You really do want to bring out the skyline of these things as much as you can. Like wherever they are placed, they were really placed in such a way that you can see them and be like, whoa, that is really one heck of a tall coaster, since they really were some record breakers back in the day. Nowadays they're sort of neglected and nobody at Cedar Point really goes to Magnum XL 200 anymore. Well, some people definitely do, but they're not really the most popular rides anymore, and they're overshadowed by many coasters that have been built in much more recent years. But they're still a very classic staple of roller coasters, despite only a few being built, and there are still many kinds of very modern hypers being built, which are still sort of a legacy of the old Aero hypers, which I'll talk about in some later videos, but this is really all I have to say about this one. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video and learned something from it, and if you have any feedback or questions, don't be afraid to leave it in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.